I'm with Ryan Lambert from Bridge Builders Forum. Now, Ryan, what is Bridge Builders Forum?
Well, thanks, Paul. I appreciate you having me today and your interest in our work. Yeah, Bridge Builders Forum is an organization that's dedicated to helping Jews and Christians better understand their faith, the Bible, and each other. And so we kind of operate in the realm of what's known as Jewish-Christian relations, where we're trying to build better relationships between Jews and Christians through education, various events, and kind of, initiatives that we're involved in. And within that calling and sort of that realm of Jewish-Christian relations, which can, mean different things to different people, our particular focus is on challenging ways of reading the New Testament that really promote negativity towards Jews and Judaism. So we're really creating resources and learning opportunities that help both Jews and Christians, but in particular, we're focused on the Christian audience and helping Christians to challenge replacement theology, to stand against anti-Semitism, and to really understand what does it mean to stand with the Jewish people. Now, even just kind of going a little bit further within that, within that focus, we really have even an even more specialized focus on the Apostle Paul in kind of reframing Paul in his Jewish and Greco-Roman context. And really, I think when you do that, Paul can all of a sudden become somebody who was, rather than being a bridge burner between Jews and Christians, can be a bridge builder, or at least his texts and his outlook. So that's a little bit about Bridge Builders Forum. Of course, we have a podcast. We have all kinds of interactive learning opportunities. Again, our audience is made up of both Jews and Christians, but the majority of our audience is Christian, and we are trying to build bridges, my friend.
Is there a lot of ignorance in the church about the Bible being a Jewish book and Jesus was a Jew? Do people actually know these things?
I think that the things you just mentioned are really, especially in recent decades, the sense of awareness of Jesus was a Jew. Hey, this is, the context, or the way many people will put it is that it's the background of the New Testament. So I think actually, Paul, maybe maybe 50 years ago and earlier, that wasn't so much on the radar screen. But I think in recent times, that is more on the radar screen of many churches across Protestant, Catholic, evangelical, and everything in between. But I think that the implications of that, and what does that really mean, and how does that affect things on the ground regarding how the New Testament is read and how the relationship, how should, Christians think about Israel and their relationship with the Jewish people, and how does the Jewishness of Jesus, and really I would say the Jewishness of Paul as well, which has really lagged behind the Jewishness of Jesus as far as from an understanding standpoint. We can talk more about that. How does this affect how Christians understand themselves, and then how that affects their relationship with Jewish people? And so that's where sort of the things continue to need to be developed, and we're developing resources to help Christians really dig into what this means and the implications of it.
Is there a danger when people read the Bible that they read it through their own culture and their own environment? I'm an Englishman, so Jesus must have been an Englishman. He must have walked on England's green and pleasant land. Is that a danger for people?
Yeah, I think that's a good, that's an interesting, I think there's kind of two sides to how I would answer your question. Of course, from a Christian standpoint, the New Testament and of course the entire Bible, these are inspired texts, right? These texts are given by God, for the purpose of strengthening, encouraging, and guiding Christians. And so from that standpoint, there's this sense of timelessness and a sense in which these sacred texts, have an application across generations. So I think it's valid for, regardless of the time and the location that a Christian finds themselves in, to ask the question, well, how does this speak to me in my context? But there is, to your question and to your point, there is a danger, though, when that context, when that valid exercise is done without giving proper attention to the actual soil from which these sacred texts sprouted. And I think something we have to remember is, let's just take, for example, the letters of Paul. we have to remember that when we're reading the letters of Paul, of course, Christians are going to say these are timeless, these are inspired, this is the Word of God. But we have to remember also that Paul wasn't writing theology. He was writing letters. And when we read these letters, we're reading someone else's mail, as it were, right? And so what that means is, okay, if we're reading someone else's mail, if he was writing to real congregations on the ground with real issues and problems, we need to then do the hard work of saying, okay, what's the context here? What are the assumptions? What's kind of going on between the lines so that I can really understand Paul's point in his time to his audience as best as possible? And that's no easy task, so that then the text can speak to us properly today. Look, if I could just give you one example where I think this is really important and relates to some of the questions you've already asked. One thing we have to remember is that within the New Testament itself, we have, Jews, a lot of Jews speaking to other Jew and other Jewish groups. And there's this sort of intra-Jewish conversation going on about who is Jesus and what are the implications of Jesus's death and resurrection. We have a lot of arguing and debate, but these are Jewish groups that are sort of going at it. And some of those conversations in the Gospels and even in Paul, they can get pretty heated and there's a lot of rhetoric and going back and forth. But it's very important we remember these are Jews talking to Jews. And so sometimes when you're talking to your family, you can get a little intense and nasty. So what's very important is we have to remember these are intra-Jewish conversations, but the danger comes is when those intra-Jewish conversations are then, when later non-Jews, when the church became increasingly non-Jewish, that context was largely either ignored or forgotten. And those intra-Jewish conversations were then weaponized as anti-Jewish critiques, right? And so that's where, again, the context is so important as believers are seeking to understand how these sacred texts apply today.
Jesus will have celebrated the Jewish holidays. So is it important as Christians that we celebrate those holidays as well so that we can actually get a feeling of what Jesus actually went through because he was Jewish?
Yeah. Great question. And of course, what's so interesting about your question, Paul, is that if we go back 50, 60 years, maybe even 30 years, nobody's asking that question, like do the, not just do the feast, but what about the Sabbath, right? Because now you've got a lot of Christians, Bible believing, even, very committed Christians in the church that are asking the question, well, all right, if Jesus celebrated the Sabbath, how does that relate? I mean, of course, famously in recent times, Charlie Kirk here in the United States, tremendous influence, and beyond the United States as well, wrote a book on the Sabbath. He was a Sabbath practicing Christian. And we're not talking about, he wasn't Seventh-day Adventist. I mean, he was an evangelical guy, right? And so this brings up a really important question. How do these Jewish practices that are found in the Torah and the Old Testament, how do they relate to Christians? And of course, there's a lot of complexity to that. But what's really interesting, I think the important thing is to remember is that, yes, Jesus and his disciples were Jews, and they continued to keep the Sabbath and the holidays. And while I would, again, different voices would answer this question differently. I would not say theologically that Christians are under covenantal obligation to observe Shabbat or the holidays, okay? That to me is a problematic line to cross. But I would say that there is a tremendous opportunity to learn about these days and to tap into the beautiful rhythms of the Jewish people. And I would say they can be a blessing and incorporated appropriately on a certain level even today. Here's the thing, Paul, again, is that especially if we go back again on the ground in the first couple generations of the Jesus movement, even as this movement is becoming, it's expanding beyond the Jewish world, Paul going out to the Gentiles. I mean, we even see in 1 Corinthians 5, he talks, and assumes, and he says, therefore let us celebrate the feast, referring to Passover in relation to the Corinthian congregation, which was primarily non-Jewish. So I do think that, I think that the apostles probably assumed that the non-Jewish Christ followers would connect and somehow incorporate the Jewish holidays, but they didn't flesh out for us all the theology and details of that. So that's something in this generation that is being taken on increasingly.
Are there two camps today in Christianity? Those who believe in the book of Genesis and those who go down the replacement theology route?
Well, that's another big question. Just like with anything else, it's hard to clearly draw the lines. But I would say, I think there's something to what you're saying in that there does seem to be a polarization today to where you have, sort of a corner or a significant number in the church that is saying, hey, we really want to press in to understand, what does it mean to stand with the Jewish people? And the church hasn't replaced Israel. So we want to stand against replacement theology. But here's the complicated thing, Paul, in that even the most hardcore replacement theology advocates still deny being replacement theology advocates, okay? Nobody wants to admit that it's just not, it ain't cool. It's not in vogue, if you will, theologically and spiritually to say, oh yeah, I believe in replacement theology. I mean, only the most fringe, I would say, Christian groups would actually own that. But the greater danger, Paul, is that I think that there is a lot of replacement theology. It's so deeply embedded in Christian theology and assumptions, oftentimes just unaware, and it's just inherited, that many Christians think, they want to stand against replacement theology, but they just don't understand what that means and how deeply it's embedded. So what's really good, I would say, in our times is that you have much greater efforts going on in Christian circles and in conversation with Jewish voices as well to try to discern, okay, how deep does this go, and what do we do to maintain allegiance to Christ, but also root out these problematic ideas that really go against God's eternal covenant with the Jewish people. So even just to give you one example of that, and this is just on an academic, scholarly level, at the Society of Biblical Literature, which again is a gathering of the top scholars in the world. There's an annual meeting every fall. There's now a group called the Society for Post-Supersessionist Theology. And I know that sounds like a mouthful, but it's a really important thing. These are scholars who are these are the scholars who are writing books that are training pastors and that are trickling down. Ultimately, what's going on there trickles down to people in pulpits and pews. And this is an entire scholarly effort to say, how deep does this replacement theology, and the more technical term is supersessionism, how deep does it go? And what do we do to provide alternative ways of understanding this that affects people in pulpits and pews? So
I think the reality is we have biblical basis through the book of Genesis that God has made a promise to Israel, and it's an eternal covenant, yet people are taking scriptures out of context. But surely if God was going to say, I'm replacing Israel, wouldn't he have got Paul to write a letter to say, look, I've changed my mind. The church has replaced Israel. Because this is such a really, really important question, isn't it? That we all need to grab a hold of and see, rather than just take one or two scriptures that we can, because everyone can twist and turn a scripture the way they want, but surely God would have said to Paul, write a new letter. The church has replaced Israel.
Yeah, so well said, Paul. And you're touching on something really, really important. I would say the problem is, there's a problem. A couple problems or a couple things I want to comment on. Oftentimes when Christians want to sort of explain why they believe in the eternal covenant that God made with the Jewish people, and that God has not replaced the Jewish people, oftentimes they will go to the book of Genesis 12, the Abrahamic covenant. I will bless those who bless you. And that is a phenomenal text. And it's great. It's a completely legitimate, strong move. The problem is, many of the Christians that they're talking to and trying to make that argument too, or be like, wait a second, that's Genesis. God did away with that. The new covenant has replaced the old covenant. So, show me in the New Testament where God's covenant with the Jewish people is eternal. And so you see what I'm saying? So now again, there's all that is a huge problem when there are Christians who are dismissing arguments from the book of Genesis. So that's a problem in and of itself. But this is, again, I'm just trying to address things that are really happening on the ground. So a lot of times, if you're just going to Genesis, that the argument or just kind of defending your position may not work so well. So in other words, one of the things I know we're very committed to as an organization is trying to help Christians make the case against replacement theology from the letters of Paul. Because if you can demonstrate, listen, Paul is right or wrong, Paul gets more airtime in sermons, books, and everything in between than any part of the Bible in Christianity. And so it's very important to be able to show that Paul thought and Paul's letters support the idea of God's eternal covenant with the Jewish people and thus challenging replacement theology. But again, Paul, one other problem is that the way Romans in particular and the way Paul has been understood, because of the assumptions, Paul is often interpreted through with replacement glasses on. And so sometimes some folks will say, well, yeah, Romans shows that, Paul thought that God was done with the Jewish people. After all, he says they're enemies of the gospel. And, he redefines who a Jew is in Romans 2, and not all who are descended from Israel are Israel. Again, these are passages I know that your audience is probably familiar with. I'm quoting Romans 9, Romans 2, Romans 11. But what my point is that many of these texts that I'm just mentioning, quick in passing, many of these texts have been translated and interpreted in ways that I think violate Paul's intent and violate their context grammatically, historically, theologically. And I think we can and we absolutely have to show from Paul that he thought he was absolutely committed to the idea that, look, yes, Israel has stumbled over the gospel, but they haven't fallen. And God's covenant with them, as he says in Romans 11, 28 and 29, it is irrevocable. And I think that's Paul's governing idea when it comes to Israel. And it's something that I think hopefully more Christians will get comfortable with emphasizing.
Do you think that replacement theology is a form of anti-Semitism? And do you think it's something that if you are replacement theology, you're probably more likely to go down the pro-Palestinian route? Do you think people would more likely go down the pro-Palestinian route rather than the pro-Israel route, the pro-Zionist route?
Yeah, wow. Okay, so a lot of questions in there. Let me try to be, and I know our time is limited, so let me try to deal with these one at a time. First of all, I think it would be lacking nuance in a significant way to draw a direct correlation, to directly equate replacement theology with anti-Semitism, because the reality is that there are many people who have a firmly entrenched replacement theology paradigm, but they're not intentionally or knowingly, and they don't hate Jews. It's just the theology that they have inherited based on translations, interpretations, and just sort of the culture of Christian theology and teaching. So I think we have to be very careful to be nuanced and in how we see this. However, the reality of history and the reality for the past 2,000 years is that with replacement theology present as sort of deeply embedded in the operating system and teaching of the church, it can lead to because what it does is replacement theology says basically, hey, God is not, in the best case, it says God is done with the Jewish people. In the worst case, it's not only God is done with the Jewish people, God is done with Judaism, he's replaced it with Christianity, all these kinds of things, but that actually Jews are the enemies of God. They are the enemies. They represent the worst kind of religion. So what replacement theology has done for 2,000 years, and this all started very early in church history, what it does is it others the Jewish people. And eventually it creates this we versus them mentality, which once you do that and you other and you demonize and this sort of represents the Jews represent the worst kind of religion, well, then that is just one step away from harm and violence, which has happened so many times in history and is still happening today, to where, there are Christians who attack Jews still today, and because they're the synagogue of Satan or their father is the devil, again, all these tropes, but again, they're based on New Testament ways of understanding the New Testament text, which ultimately come back to replacement theology. So that's, in my mind, the relationship and the danger of replacement theology. But I think it also, Paul, something very important. This is not just about how this affects Jews. I want to really hit this hard. This is also about, it is, and that's very important, but this is also about how the church understands itself. I think Paul was very passionate, and I think this is consistent throughout the New Testament, to help the church to understand its own, the ecclesia, the body of Christ, part of its own sense of identity and understanding, and what would position it for flourishing was for it to see itself as grafted into the olive tree alongside the Jewish people, and to see Israel, the Jewish people, the Torah, all these things, to have a proper, humble relationship to those things as sort of a core part of the church's own identity. So when the church goes down the road of replacement theology, it's not only contaminating its attitude towards Jews and Judaism, it's hurting the church's own sense of identity, which is going to hinder the church's ability to flourish. Because if we don't know who we are, or if the church doesn't know who it is, nobody can flourish. So, okay, that's my best shot at being brief about replacement theology. Now, you were asking about how does this affect the Palestinian issue and Zionism.
Are you more likely to go down the pro-Palestinian route if you believe in replacement theology?
Yeah, I think, okay, that's a great point. Yeah, and I think the answer is absolutely. I think that, again, as you know as well as anybody, the issues on the ground in the modern state of Israel are so complicated, and there's a lot to this. But from a theological standpoint, yes, I think that if you've accepted the idea that God is essentially done with the Jewish people, or God is punishing the Jewish people, again, all these things are kind of aspects of replacement theology, then, it could position you to maybe be more inclined to be supportive of the Palestinian argument. But again, I want to be careful, because I think that it's important for people who have said, hey, we're against replacement theology, because that they see that they have a heart for the Palestinian people as well. I guess my point is that if you have embraced the paradigm of replacement theology, then I think it also, along with that, is going to make you think, well, the Jewish people don't have a right to be, they have no biblical connection to the land of Israel. And so that, I think, can play into this in some very complicated ways.
Tell us about your book, Weird Apostle.
Yeah, sure. So as you say, I published a book in 2024, so it's been out about 2 years now, called The Weird Apostle. And, people are like, whoa, who's the weird apostle? Is it Peter? Is it, most people guess Peter or Paul? It's Paul. And I use the title, or I use the word weird, not in any way to reference something weird as in substandard. Weird is in the sense of defamiliarizing, kind of the familiar Paul that is a Paul who, Saul the Jew became Paul the Christian. Paul used to practice Judaism, but then he converted to Christianity. Or Paul is the founder of a new religion called Christianity. Again, that's the familiar Paul. And my argument is, if we really want to understand Paul, the Paul of his letters, the Paul of Acts, so in other words, the historical Paul, if we want to better understand him, we have to put him back. We have to sort of defamiliarize ourselves with those ideas and put ourselves back in his Jewish and Greco-Roman context. And we're going to meet then a Paul who is very different, a Paul who continued to operate within Judaism as the apostle to the nations, a Paul who didn't see Judaism as a problem to be solved, We see a Paul who, rather than being converted on the Damascus Road, and again, that is a big one, Paul, as you know. I mean, so many people just assume that Paul the Jew became Paul the Christian on the Damascus Road. Well, it doesn't say that in Acts or in Paul's letters, but the way I like to frame it is that Paul was not converted, he was called. Called, not converted. He received a calling to share the message of redemption of the God of Israel through Jesus to the nations. That's very different than saying Paul saw Judaism as an empty, bankrupt religion that needed to be done away with and replaced with a better, grace-saturated religion that we know now as Christianity. Again, all these things are props. So I deal with all of those issues. I talk about Paul and his upbringing and his continued identity as a Pharisee. That's another big one, Paul, in that, so many people think that Pharisee is, the Pharisees were this awful, horrible group. Well, a problem with that is that twice in the New Testament, Paul identifies as a Pharisee, as a follower of Jesus. So again, that feels a little strange or weird, but if we really want to get to know Paul and understand his letters better, these are the kinds of things that we need to excavate. And that's what my book seeks to do.
What is your prayer for Jewish-Christian relations today?
Ooh, that's a big one. Yeah. My prayer for Jewish-Christian relations today is that God would move in just miraculous ways, little by little, to restore a sense of family between Jews and Christians, to where differences, look, the reality is, and in all of this, we have to say, Paul, Jews and Christians have some very different convictions, but there's also a tremendous amount in common and that we share. And I really think that Paul, in particular, the Apostle Paul, but again, it goes beyond that. I would say even and Jesus as well, that they would want us for Jews and Christians to see each other as spiritual siblings, or as my friend, a Catholic scholar, good friend, or friend of mine, Phil Cunningham says, co-covenanting companions. And I think another aspect of that prayer is that would be that we would leave room for the mystery of God. Romans 11, Paul ends that chapter not with answering all of our questions. He ends that chapter with worship and with a sense of mystery. And I think that we need to have that. But ultimately, my prayer is, Paul, that Jews and Christians would restore or find, maybe for the first time, this sense of we're siblings and family doesn't always get along or see things eye to eye, but we have to stick together. That's my prayer.
What's your website for people who'd like to learn more about the work that you're doing?
So best way I'm going to give you two ways that folks can reach out. One would be the main website, which is bridgebuildersforum.com. You can learn about our olive tree campaign there and all kinds of things that we have going on, as well as interactive learning opportunities. Sign up our email newsletter. But then also we have kind of our front porch is our weekly podcast. We're on YouTube, Apple, Spotify, and you just search Bridge Builders Forum, and you'll see all the stuff we have available.
Well, Ryan, thank you very much for sharing today.
It's been a pleasure, Paul. Thanks so much. Great questions, and I've enjoyed the conversation.